All rise. Veuillez vous lever. Please be seated. Veuillez vous asseoir.
Mr. Milne.
Your Honours, out of respect for the deceased and their families, we shall not show now detailed photographs of the injuries which were inflicted upon them. What may be instructive, though, is to see the effect of the blast upon the vehicles which had been in the convoy. And the pictures we're about to show were taken the following year, when those vehicles were in a police barracks where they had been preserved since removal from the scene. Examination of the damage to the vehicles enabled analysts to determine the order and arrangement of the convoy at the moment of the explosion. And this graphic, prepared as part of a report by Spanish experts, shows the approximate positions that the vehicles were in. Vehicle 401 was damaged severely, but all of the occupants survived. This, of course, the Land Cruiser. Vehicle 402 was also badly damaged. Again, the occupants survived. Both 401 and 402 display clear evidence that the blast was behind them, as the main damage sustained is to the rear of the vehicle, and 402 contained its phone jammer visible here in the trunk of the car. That is the cream-looking box on the left-hand side. Vehicle 403, Mr. Hariri's car, was very badly damaged and subsequently gutted by fire. Vehicle 404 was torn apart by the explosion. What we show here, the fragments on the ground, constitute all that was recovered of this vehicle. Compared to the other vehicles, this suffered by far the most catastrophic damage and was therefore clearly the closest to the seat of the explosion. Vehicle 405 was also very severely damaged and again was gutted by fire. And vehicle 406 was also badly fire damaged, although the frame is still recognizable. 406 had not reached the center of the blast and stopped short of it, as was indicated by the crater. We show those not out of concern for cars, but because in our submission this explosion was a cruel act. On 14th February, the Lebanese ISF, that is Internal Security Forces officers, attended the scene, and a search was carried out to see if identifiable parts of the explosive device could be located. A number of vehicle parts were discovered, some of those retrieved from the crater which was created by the bomb. And over the following days and weeks, further items were gathered. An initial attempt to identify the type of vehicle used was made by simply taking some of the larger vehicle parts to the offices of car and van dealerships in the Beirut area. The first dealership which was able to make a positive identification was that linked to the Mitsubishi Corporation. The parts which were shown were confirmed, in many cases, to have come from a Mitsubishi Fuso vehicle, which is a popular style of van known as a canter. And the description of a canter matched closely the vehicle seen in the tunnel and on the CCTV a few moments before the explosion. No further sighting of that vehicle was seen after the explosion. It was not found intact at the site of the explosion, and indeed no other Mitsubishi vehicle was identified as being present at the scene of the blast. The most important part of the vehicle which was discovered was found in August of 2005, so 6 months after the blast, when a Dutch team of forensic investigators, in conjunction with the Lebanese authorities, carried out a very careful search of the area in front of the Saint-Georges Hotel. One of their investigators found this, a piece of the engine casing of the engine block, which bore a clearly identifiable number. This number, seen there in close-up, was referred back to Mitsubishi, and it was determined as belonging to the engine block of a Canter van, a Mitsubishi Canter van, built in Japan. That engine block, as the court may be aware, is a heavy piece of steel, and it had been blown to pieces. In fact, subsequent examination of this item and others revealed that the surface of the items had been subject to extreme stress. The vehicle, identified by the engine block number, had been imported through the UAE into Lebanon and had been sold for cash by a vehicle dealership in Tripoli, north of Beirut, in January of 2005, so a matter of weeks before the explosion. There was no record of the name of the person purchasing it, and no record could be found of any movement of the vehicle before it was seen in Beirut on the 14th of February. As the tribunal is already aware, a claim of responsibility in the form of a videotape was publicized shortly after this blast occurred. And in that tape, an individual, identified as Abu Adas, made a series of claims apparently concerning the attack. We will return in due course to the topic of this claim, which the prosecution maintains was a deliberate and false attempt to mislead the investigation. But suffice it to say that as the investigations went on, having identified Abu Adas, investigators took steps to obtain samples of DNA which would reflect his DNA, and this was principally in the form of samples provided by his mother and his sister. Comparisons were then made scientifically between every DNA profile extracted from organic human remains recovered at the scene and the DNA profile of his mother and sister. And on the basis of this analysis, it's possible to say with certainty that none of those matches were remains of Abu Adas. Indeed, there is no evidence that the prosecution have identified which would support the suggestion that Abu Adas played any role in the assassination of Mr. Hariri and the other victims, apart from that tape. Another area of intense investigation was the nature of the bomb used. Several attempts to identify the type of explosive proved fruitless in the early stages. In September 2005, the same team of Dutch experts from the Netherlands Forensic Institute, who were examining the crime scene, were assisted in their role by Dr. Gerard Murray of the Forensic Service of Northern Ireland. Dr. Murray provided them with swabbing kits for the purposes of explosives analysis. That swabbing was undertaken and supervised by the Dutch team, and the samples were then submitted to the Forensic Service of Northern Ireland laboratory for analysis. The swabs had been applied to items which had been recovered from the scene which showed signs of having been very close to the explosion. Those items included some which were later identified as being parts of the Mitsubishi Canter. And what we see on this slide, and indeed on the following one, we see the two together, are parts of the Canter van which bore explosive residue. The checks that had been carried out were for the presence of the most commonly used forms of organic explosives. And the analysis that was undertaken showed significant traces of one type of a military-grade, very powerful high explosive. The technical name is cyclotrimethylene trinitramine, fortunately known by its abbreviation of RDX, by which we'll refer to it in future. RDX is used principally for military applications, and it's a component in other explosive mixtures, such as C4 or PE4. It is 1.35 times more powerful than TNT, by which I mean that 1 kilo of RDX is equivalent in explosive strength to 1.35 kilos of TNT, and the relevance of that I will explain in a moment. But the presence of these significant trace amounts of RDX, in the view of Dr. Murray, strongly supports the view that it was an RDX-based explosive which was used, and his tests detected no other form of commonly encountered organic explosive residue. Also part of the analysis was consideration of the size of the crater created by the explosion. That too was assessed by a representative of the Dutch NFI, relying upon photographs which had been taken within a short time of the explosion and some taken thereafter. His calculation was that the crater, although irregular in shape, resembled an inverted cone with an upper diameter of 11.4 meters and a lower diameter of 8.3 meters and a depth of 1.9 meters. And the size was important as it would provide crucial data for the calculation for the size and the nature of the bomb that had been used. It was also established by a group of Swiss experts, and they were amongst the first international forensic experts to view the scene, that, as we've heard, windows in buildings as far away as 300 meters from the explosion had been shattered in the blast. It was also established that by subsequent examination of the lower parts of the buildings on either side of the blast, that is the Saint-Georges and the Byblos, that revealed that both had suffered serious blast damage. Each of these factors, taken together, provided crucial evidence. But the actual calculation concerning the bomb was carried out at the request of the OTP by two Argentinian experts who were commissioned specifically for that purpose. And based upon all the available material, they were able to use computer modeling to establish how much explosive would have been used. The figures which they achieve are expressed, and we will use this phrase in future. They're expressed in terms of weight as TNT equivalent. And that's a measure of explosive force. It doesn't mean, of course, that TNT was the explosive material. The physical weight of the actual explosive used can only be determined if you know the nature of the explosive itself. Their evidence before this tribunal will explain that whilst the crater, given the dimensions we know, could have been caused by a small bomb below ground or a large bomb above ground, a subsurface, a below-ground explosion by a subsurface device could not account for the damage to the buildings or for the damage sustained to windows. The nature of the building damage could only be explained by a device above ground, and computer modeling revealed that that was specifically of the order of 80 centimeters above ground. The shape of the crater on the computer analysis was consistent with the explosive material being shaped essentially in an oblong, flat configuration. And the size of the bomb, on their computer-generated figures, was 2.5 to 3 tons TNT equivalent. I come back to the earlier reference I made to the RDX. Given the earlier detection of RDX as the main or predominant explosive material, and the fact that RDX is 1.35 times more explosive than TNT, the actual weight of RDX required would be in the order of about 2 tons. Accordingly, the prosecution can say that the size of the bomb, its shape, and its height are all consistent with it being carried on the back of a flatbed truck of the type seen seconds before the blast. The same factors, of course, rule it out as being carried by a car, given the weight. Your Honours, in short, the prosecution case is that a group of determined, disciplined men conspired together to organise and perpetrate the assassination of Rafik Hariri by means of this devastating terrorist bomb, and that the 5 named accused persons were but a larger part of an uncertain number, the 4 named accused, and Merai, who is named as a co-conspirator, that they knew and that they accepted that the bombing would kill or injure many others, and they accepted that consequence with apparent equanimity. The prosecution will say that they had access to and they utilised modern technology, high-grade military materiel, that they planned the attack over many months, and you'll hear about military-style surveillance and precise planning, that they used telephone networks that have been put in place and maintained for months before the actual conspiracy, and that the conspiracy extended, of course, to the planning and activation of the false claim of responsibility. The prosecution's case will seek to demonstrate that this bombing was executed by means of the vehicle-borne improvised explosive device in the Mitsubishi Canter van using military-grade explosive and activated by the unknown suicide bomber. And the prosecution will further seek to show that 2 of the main organisers of that attack were the first 2 accused, aided and abetted by the remaining 2 defendants and others. Your Honour, that is all I propose to say, and I will hand now to Mr. Cameron, who will deal with the next stage of the opening.
Mr. Cameron.
Mr. President, learned judges, the prosecution has earlier described to the trial chamber the nature of its case in very broad terms as consisting of 3 general sections. My learned colleague, Mr. Milne, has taken you through the anticipated evidence in connection with the first section relating to the forensic evidence found at the scene and the evidence relevant to the victims of the blast. I would like now to provide you with an overview of the evidence relating to the other 2 sections. The first of these is concerned with the preparatory acts undertaken by the 4 accused and their various co-conspirators in 2004 and 2005. Viewed as a whole, these acts were extensive and enabled the accused to achieve the following 4 connected purposes. The first was to identify a location to carry out the murder of the former Prime Minister. Before you is a slide before the blast showing the area in which was chosen by the co-conspirators. To the right-hand side, you can see the Byblos building and the St. George Hotel as Mr. Milne aptly indicated, forming a canyon which would contain the blast that was set off in the midst. The second connected purpose was to gather sufficiently reliable information about Rafiq Hariri's daily movements to be able to predict when the former Prime Minister would arrive at the place chosen for his assassination. The slide before you, you've seen before, is Rafiq Hariri in Nejmeh Square minutes before his death. The third purpose was to prepare the instrument which killed the former Prime Minister and murdered and maimed so many others. The Mitsubishi Canter van carrying the massive bomb, which one of their number drove with such precision to its designated spot, where it was detonated at exactly the right time. See now a picture of the Mitsubishi Canter van in the tunnel. And the fourth connected purpose was to orchestrate an elaborate ruse many weeks in advance to divert attention away from themselves and to blame others for the attack. In effect, a deliberate attempt to trick the Lebanese people into believing falsely that others were to blame for the murder of their former Prime Minister. Before you is a still photograph from the video showing Abu Adas, which the prosecution will contend was a fiction. That's the evidence relating to the first section, and I'll elaborate on it in a moment. The second section focuses on the evidence which the prosecution relies upon to identify for the trial chamber the leaders of the conspiracy. The four accused who, with the assistance of others, were responsible for the offenses charged in the indictment. In essence, these two sections of the evidence deal with two questions. How was this done, and who did it? As been noted earlier, the analysis of cellular telephone communication data retained by service providers in Lebanon in and around the material time is one of the central evidentiary features of the case for the prosecution. Later, I'll describe the nature of this evidence in a little more detail, but in its simplest terms for the moment. That telecommunication data has been provided from two different sources and relates to two different areas. The public of Lebanon owns two mobile phone networks. As you can see from the slide before you, in alphabetical order, the first formal name is Mobile Interim Company 1 SAL, MIC1, which is known as Alpha. Alpha is managed by Orascom, ORASCOM, Telecom Holdings. It was previously operated by Celis, and you'll see why I mention that in a moment. The second is Mobile Interim Company 2, SAL, MIC2, also known as Mobile Telecommunications Company, or MTC. This was previously operated by Libancell. For simplicity, I expect you'll become accustomed to the parties and witnesses referring to these two companies in their common short form as Alpha and MTC. There's a third company listed on the slide, which I won't refer to, except by its acronym OGERO, which was responsible for the administration of landline telephones in Lebanon under the supervision of the government of Lebanon. The telecommunications data received from Alpha and from MTC form two different pools of evidence. The first pool relates to the records each company kept in the course of its business regarding the use of individual cellular phones. The raw data provided by the companies to the Special Tribunal for Lebanon was added to a secure database. The data was then rendered into a readable and searchable format from which relevant extracts have been made for the convenience of the trial chamber. These extracts are now commonly referred to as call sequence tables, or by their acronym CST. The original raw data encompasses individual records of billions of calls and text messages. The call sequence tables comprise a very tiny subset of this data provided by the companies, and this subset constitutes a manageable pool of intelligible and relevant data for the trial chamber to consider. The call sequence tables contain the most probative aspects of the communications data. The individual sequence tables relate to a single number. In the example that you see on the slide now, that call sequence table relates to the green phone kept by the accused Mustafa Badruddin. And you can see that beginning on the left-hand but one column, the call sequence table will record the date of the call, the time of the call to the second, the number of the telephone initiating the call, the number of the telephone receiving the call, the duration of the call in seconds, the handset used, which at the head of that column says IMEI, which is a technical term, an acronym for International Mobile Equipment Identity, but it's the handset. And finally, the name of the cell site to which the telephone connects to initiating the call. And I'll come to the significance of the cell site in a moment. You can see that the first call, or you may see that the first call on this page is between green 300 and green 023. The information about the cell sites to which green 300 connected when receiving this particular call would be found on the corresponding call sequence table for green 300. Now, the second pool of evidence provided by the companies, the two companies, relates to the cell sites and towers themselves. I expect that you will hear that this data was received from the companies in various stages and has been assembled and organized by the prosecution. Each of the two service providers had its own set of cell towers. By convention, the name of Alpha's cell tower appear in uppercase letters, while MTC uses a mixture of upper and lowercase in their names. I'll refer again to this evidence a little later, and I expect that you will be taken through it in considerable detail at the appropriate time of trial. But at this stage, it can be distilled to four key pieces of information. The first is the cell tower name and location, which is defined by longitude and latitude. Second is the name of the cells that provide coverage from the cell tower. Third is the azimuth, which is a directional line pointing from the cell tower itself into the direction of the cell coverage. Now, on the slide before you, which is labeled azimuth, this slide represents a very notional, idealized version of what a cell site is. The cell tower is signified by the blue circle in the center of the three hexagonal shapes. The three hexagonal shapes named A, B, and C represent cell site locations or plots, and the azimuth emanating from the cell tower out through the middle of those cell plots reflects the direction of coverage. The fourth piece of information in this area is the best predicted server coverage of the cell towers. We move now from the ideal notion of a hexagon to a plot that was prepared by one of the two companies. In this case, because we know that they're all uppercase letters, it's Alpha, for étoile 1. which is a small cell site covering the area of Parliament and which you'll hear about frequently as my opening remarks progress. The image that you see represents a physical overlay on an underlying map of Beirut. And I'll come to the limitations of that overlay in a moment. During the material time, MTC and Alpha both provided cell site coverage through approximately 800 cell towers in Lebanon. Each cell tower has in the normal course between 1 and 4 cell site areas associated with it. For your convenience, and should you wish to receive it later, we have prepared an atlas of both Alpha and MTC cell sites listed alphabetically and printed on large paper identifying the relevant towers, the various azimuths, and their predicted coverage areas. A little later, I'll explain how the combination of these pieces of information about the cell sites and the data recorded within the call sequence tables is important in understanding the preparatory acts of the accused and their co-conspirators, and, in addition, important in identifying the principal actors as the 4 accused charged in the indictment before you and their co-conspirator, Mr. Marai.
Mr. Cameron, just a moment ago you offered to provide us with an A3. Are you referring to during your opening statement or at a later point in the
I'm
the
not.
trial?
When it's convenient for you to receive it during the course of the evidence or sometime after the start of trial, that's when I intended to provide it to you, should you wish to have it and should you find it useful.
Thank you.
Before proceeding any further with the nature of the data, I'd like to turn to the nature of the cellular phones which the prosecution submits underlay the acts of the accused in furtherance of the conspiracy to assassinate the former Prime Minister. For the purposes of this trial, the prosecution will refer to 4 different categories of cellular phones during the course of the evidence. The first is sequential mobile phones, or SMPs. The second is personal mobile phones, or PMPs. The third is groups of phones identified by color, and the fourth are mission phones, also identified by color. Now, the first of these I'll deal with very briefly now. Sequential mobile phones, or SMPs, are really only relevant in connection with the accused Mustafa Badreddine. And their primary probative value arises in the area of attribution, i.e. the body of evidence relevant to the issue of whether Mustafa Badreddine was the user of Green 023. I'll leave the SMP category to one side for now. I'll return to it later, and I'll address the other 3 in order. Personal mobile phones, or PMPs, are phones used by individuals for a variety of purposes, including personal and family use. They are distinct from what I'll refer to later as mission phones or operational phones. While the prosecution will ask you to consider that some PMP phones were used for communication in furtherance of the offenses, they were not devoted exclusively to that purpose. The second group of phones are referred to by the prosecution as grouped by color. These phones are somewhere between PMPs and mission phones. The prosecution has described these as the yellow group and the purple group of phones. These groups do not necessarily consistently display the discipline of use and singularity of purpose as the mission phones, which I'll come to in a moment, but they do figure very significantly in some aspects of the preparatory acts leading to the assassination of the Prime Minister. More particularly, it will be the position of the prosecution that a number of the phones in the yellow group are involved in the surveillance of Rafiq Hariri in late December and early January until they are set aside as surveillance tools and replaced by blue and red mission phones in early January. It is also the position of the prosecution that the purple phones were used by the accuseds Onesi, Sabra, and their co-conspirator Hassan Merai to communicate.
It appears that the transcript is frozen on our screens. Is that a common experience? Okay. Can we just pause for a moment to obtain some technical assistance from somewhere?
I'm okay. Thanks. Oh, thanks very much.
We're told we just need another minute for the technicians to work their magic.
I'll wait your pleasure.
Microphone, please.
I'm told that the system will be rebooted, but we can continue meanwhile, and the transcript is being recorded, but will reappear on our screen. So, if that's convenient with you, Mr. Cameron, please continue.
Thank you very much. I last was speaking about the position of the prosecution in respect to the purple phones, which were used by the accused Onesi Sabra and their co-conspirator Hassan Merai to communicate with each other in connection with the preparation and delivery of materials they manufactured to advance the false claim of responsibility. The purple and yellow phones are important but their evidentiary significance arises from their use, unlike the mission or operations phones, which have characteristics in addition to their use, which reveal their intended purpose. So I'll turn now to mission or operations phones. The body of evidence demonstrating the nature and use of these groups of phones is one of the most important aspects of the case for the prosecution. There are three groups of phones in this category. First is the green network, the second the blue network, and the third the red network. It is the position of the prosecution that when considered as a whole, the evidence is not only compelling, but overwhelming that these groups of phones were used as operational tools during the material time for the express purpose of coordinating the activities of the accused and their co-conspirators, leading to the assassination of the former Prime Minister. The characteristics of each of these mission phones is different. The evidentiary importance of these groups of phones deserves some attention at this stage of the opening statement. I'll deal now with the green phone network. What the prosecution refers to as the green phone network was born out of a group of 18 phones, all purchased in July and August of 2004. The phones were unique in a number of aspects, significant aspects. I expect the evidence to show that during the material time, there were two methods of obtaining access to cellular telephone lines from service providers in Lebanon: buying credit in advance without the necessity of a contract or prepaid phones, and arranging for a contract for a specified period requiring monthly payments, postpaid phones. The green network phones were the only example of mission phones that were postpaid. This network, as I'm indicated, started out its life as a group of 18 phones purchased in two shops located in South Beirut over the course of 4 or 5 weeks in July of August 2004. There were 9 identities provided in order to obtain contracts with Alpha for these phones. Each identity was associated with 2 phones. The terms of each contract were identical for all 18 phones. On the evidence, it will be the position of the prosecution that these 18 phones were purchased with the intention that they would be managed as a group. Because postpaid phones require a contractual relationship between the supplier and the purchaser, the application process is more complicated than obtaining a prepaid phone. I expect the evidence to show that the following process was followed in respect of Alpha postpaid contracts. 1, the customer chose the phone number from the dealer, completed an application form giving very specific particulars concerning his name, address, his father's name, his date and place of birth, and the name and branch of his bank. Second, the dealer then submitted that completed application to Alpha for approval. Third, once Alpha approved the application, it activated the SIM card so that it could be used in a handset, and then provided the activated SIM card to the dealer. You'll hear evidence that a SIM card, or a subscriber information module, is one of the 2 principal components of a cellular phone, the other being the handset. The SIM card stores the telephone number as well as other information. Fourth, the customer then appeared again at the dealer's shop to pick up the activated SIM card. In this case, the applications also included copies of the identity cards of the subscribers. And I'm about to show you a series of 3 slides relating to green 023, green 071, and green 300. The last one, 023, is in respect of a phone the prosecution will contend was possessed by Mr. Marai. These identity cards, which are shown on the right-hand side of the screen, with the application on the left, you'll see at the top, Celis. The identity cards that appear on the right-hand side of the screen appear on their face to be genuine and purport to have been issued by the Lebanese Minister of Interior and Municipalities. Each card contained a facsimile of the official stamp of the ministry, which you can see at the lower middle of the card. However, I expect the evidence to show that the Ministry of Interior and Municipalities in Lebanon has confirmed that they have no records in respect of any of the 9 identity cards submitted in support of the 18 applications for what the prosecution refers to as the Green Network. Now, it will be open to you to find that the documents presented to obtain these 18 contracts with Alpha were forgeries. 9 sets of false official documents had been created and used to obtain the 18 Alpha contracts. This element of deceit is the first significant feature of this group of phones. The next question becomes, why was it thought necessary to use false identities to obtain the contracts? A very common reason for using false documents to obtain goods and services is to perpetrate a fraud upon the seller, or in this case the service provider, to obtain the goods and services without actually paying the full amount owed. I expect that the evidence will demonstrate clearly that fraud was not the motive here, but something entirely different. The business records of Alpha revealed that someone appeared in person at the service counter of Alpha Customer Service Center, located in Fern El Shabak in Beirut, near the end of each month, and paid the full amount owing for all 18 phones in cash. These personal appearances and cash payments continued every month from September 2004 to May 2005, after which the payments stopped and never resumed. Significantly, the payments in person could not have been in response to an invoice received from Alpha, because the addresses and names supplied to the company in the application forms were false. Someone was responsible for anticipating the payment date and ensuring that the 18 phones were paid for each month in accordance with the contract.
Mr. Cameron, the bad news is that the transcript can't be restored until the break. But the good news is that you can continue, unless anyone has any objections to him continuing without a transcript. It appears that I emphasise the proceedings are being recorded and the transcript will be available later today. No objections, please continue, Mr. Cameron.
I'm grateful, thank you. So as I spoke, someone was responsible for anticipating the payment date and ensuring that the 18 phones were paid for each month in accordance with the contract so that they could continue to function. In effect, someone was responsible for the maintenance of at least this aspect of these 18 phones from August 2004 to May 2005. And I expect the evidence to show that the initial payments to Alpha to activate the 18 Green Network SIM cards totaled $1,260, while the total monthly maintenance fees amounted to $6,115, giving the aggregate sum paid for the cellular telephone lines at $7,375, and additional monies would have had to be expended to purchase the handsets. These regular monthly payments demonstrate that the motive underlying the presentation of false documents to obtain the telephone contracts was not to defraud Alpha. The only remaining inference is that false documents were created and used so that the users of those 18 phones could neither be identified nor traced, and that this was the deliberate intention of the purchaser at the time of the acquisition of the phones.
Message from the English booth. The gentleman is speaking too fast for accurate interpretation.
They're used in the weeks.
Mr. Cameron, You don't have your headphones on. This will be the first, I imagine, of several interventions from the interpreters asking you to please slow down. We must all bear that in mind, and also for the court transcriber.
I do apologize to the transcriber and to the interpreters whose job is difficult at best. The first area of significance and the unusual aspect that I dealt with was in respect of the element of deceit, which I expect the evidence to show was not for fraud, but to maintain the anonymity of the purchasers of the phone. The second very telling area of evidence is how they were used in the weeks following their purchase. The evidence should be seen against the backdrop of the evidence that every month, of course, someone was paying for these phones. The last payment was in May 2005, and the phones were deactivated. Against that backdrop, 5 of the phones of the group of 18 were only used for a period of less than 60 days, from 4 August to the 1st of October 2004, and never after that. A little later, I'll review why the fact that these phones were not used after October 1st, 2004 is significant. 5 further lines were not used until April 2005. One of those only made a single call. 3 phones were used only intermittently between August 2004 and July 2005. But during the material time in the indictment, the number of calls made from these 3 phones may fairly be described as minimal, and the phones were principally in contact with a single number. However, 3 phones began to operate in an entirely different manner than the other 15. And those appear, their numbers appear on the screen now. The calling activity among these 3 phones is something I'll come to in a moment. But notwithstanding that all the other phones were being maintained through regular monthly payments, what's happening with the other 15? Other than sporadic calls from 3 of the phones, almost all to a single number, the other phones either fell silent as of October 1st if they were in use, or if they were not, did not start to be used until after April 2005, after the assassination of the former Prime Minister. This means that from the 1st of October 2004 until after the 14th of February 2005, the entire group of phones was virtually unused, despite being paid for each month, except for the 3 at issue in this trial. Those 3 phone numbers, we contend, are attributable to the accused Badreddine, the accused Marai, and the accused, I'm sorry, not the accused Marai, the co-conspirator Marai, and the accused Ayyash, as illustrated by that slide. The manner in which these 3 phones, these remaining phones were used, constitutes the third aspect of evidentiary significance as to the Green Network. Now, if I may make a brief word about nomenclature here. To make things simpler, and for the purposes of the trial, the prosecution has adopted the convention of using usually 3 separate components to refer to cellular phone numbers. And these can be illustrated by the following example. The first is to shorten the telephone number to the last 3 digits. The second is to identify which telephone network the phone is a member of by color. The third is to refer to the accused if it's the position of the prosecution there's evidence attributing that particular phone to an accused. Fourth, there have been a series of subject numbers used to refer to individuals whose actual identity remains unknown, but who appear to be consistent users of one or more phones. On this issue, I expect the evidence to show that some individuals use more than one network phone. S9, which you can see on that slide, is assigned a blue number, blue 864, and also a yellow number, yellow 024. And I expect that it will be open to you to find that the user of blue 864 and the user of yellow 024 are the same person. There will be many references throughout the evidence to individual users associated with multiple phones. And where the identified user is named as an accused, the body of evidence capable of attributing the use of the telephone to him is broader than where the subject is unknown. So, returning to the green phones, from the beginning of October 2004 until February 2005, these three phones functioned as a completely closed network among themselves. There appear to have been very clear protocols as to the phone's usage, and there also appear to have been a high degree of discipline demonstrated by the accused Badruddin and Ayyash and their co-conspirator Hassan Merai in the use of the green phones. You'll see a slide before you now showing a triangle, the apex of which is green 023 for Badruddin, the left hand for Ayyash, and the right hand bottom for the co-conspirator Merai. And the protocols that governed the usage of the green phone, which were adhered to, are the following. No green phone made a call to or received a call from any other phone except for one of the other green phones. So, green 023 at the apex Badruddin called both green 300 Ayyash to the left and green 071 Merai to the right. Green 300 Ayyash called only green 023 Badruddin, but never 071 Merai. That's why there's a solid line from Badruddin to Ayyash, a solid line from Badruddin to Merai, and no line from Ayyash to Merai. Similarly, 071 Merai called 023 Badruddin, but never green Ayyash. That was the protocol of use. In addition, no phone was used to send or receive SMS text messages. Near the outset of this regime, there were 3 examples of stray incoming calls prior to October 13th from one of the other green phones, which lasted only seconds and were never repeated after the 13th of October. Thereafter, the protocols were followed until the phones were abandoned. The last call of green 071, which was Merai's phone, was 7 days before the attack. About an hour before the former Prime Minister was assassinated on 14 February 2005, green 300, who was Ayyash, was close to the scene of the planned explosion and made his final call to Badruddin on his green phone, and their phones were never used again. I'm going to return to how these green phones were actually used by the 2 accused and their co-conspirator Merai after I've turned to the nature of the other 2 sets of mission phones, the blue and red groups of phones. However, based upon the evidence I've just described, it would be open to the tribunal to find the following in respect of the green phones. That the green phones were purchased using forged documents for the express and sole purpose of concealing the identities of the users. Second, that the 3 green phones used by the accused and their co-conspirator Marai were a subset of a larger group of phones which were maintained in readiness to be used for covert purposes. Third, the person or persons controlling the use of the green phones wielded sufficient operational authority to effectively silence all of the other green phones in the group, with the minimal transient exceptions I referred to earlier, so that the other 15 phones were either not active or fell silent during the months leading up to Rafiq Hariri's murder. These 3 phones were used in the last week and in the hour before the assassination, and never again. Taken as a whole, this is powerful and compelling evidence that this network of 18 phones was intended to be used as a covert operational tool for an illicit purpose or purposes. At some point, one of those purposes crystallized into the assassination of the former Prime Minister. At that point, virtually all of the other green phones fell silent, even though thousands of dollars were being paid to maintain them. And these 3 green phones emerged to form a completely closed network for the purpose of coordinating the events leading to the explosion of 14 February. 2 of them right up until the hour of the bomb's detonation, before they disappeared forever. Turning now to the second group of mission phones, the Blue Network. During the material time, the Blue Network consisted of between 3 and up to 15 phones, all of which were prepaid. 7 of the phones used the services of Alpha, and 8 used MTC as a provider. The Blue phones enter the picture during the material time in 3 groups. The first group consists of 3 phones which were purchased sometime in early October 2004. These 3 phones are set out before you, and the subject numbers which the prosecution attributes these phones to by virtue of their use are S5, S7, and S14. You will hear a lot of evidence concerning the activities of S5 and S7 from the early stages of the conspiracy right up until the minutes of the explosion. Oh, I'm very sorry. S is merely a letter suggesting subject.
As in an unknown person?
Yes,
Thank you.
yes. So I mentioned earlier that eventually the Blue Network would be comprised of 15 phones. The first group were the following 3 phones that you see before you. And these 3 phones were purchased sometime in the first week of October 2004. All 3 used MTC as the cellular service provider, and all 3 were first used on the same day, October 18th, 2004. Now, unlike postpaid phones, it appears that it was not necessary to present identification to the seller, whether the provider was Alpha or MTC, in order to obtain a prepaid phone. it was entirely possible to acquire active SIM cards from either provider anonymously. However, I expect the evidence to show that throughout this period, there was an incentive program instituted by the service providers to receive information about the purchasers of their services for their own marketing purposes. Sellers would be rewarded for supplying names and addresses of their customer to the company supplying the service. That bonus was not available to a dealer who sold the phone to an anonymous customer unless the dealer passed along to the company someone else's name. I expect the evidence to show that some dealers did, in fact, pass along either fictitious names and addresses or recycled the particulars of other customers in order to benefit from the company's incentive programs. I expect the evidence to show that the names formally associated with these 3 prepaid blue phones, as well as the other 12 blue phones, which I'll come to shortly, were either fictitious, recycled, or in the case of 2 phones, entirely absent. The prosecution does not rely upon the falsity of these particular records as acts associated with the commission of the offenses. Unlike the falsified documents used in connection with the obtaining of contracts from Alpha for the Green Network phones, which are attributable to the purchaser of those phones, it could well be that the sellers of the blue phones who provided incorrect information to the supplier were responsible, not the purchaser. However, it is the position of the prosecution that the inference remains available that no information concerning identity was provided by the purchasers of the blue network cards to the dealer or dealers, because if it had, there would have been no reason for the dealers to use recycled or fictitious names. Now, to return to the blue phones then, from the moment of their first use on 18 October 2004, these 3 initial blue phones became virtually a closed network. While there were sporadic incoming calls to these 3 numbers from time to time, all of brief duration, none of these 3 blue phones made outgoing calls to any other phone outside the blue network. In late December, other phones began to be added to the blue network, bringing the number to 15, as I've indicated earlier, by early January 2005. However, in this interim period between October 18 and 22nd of December 2004, these 3 phones purchased in early October followed exactly the same 5 protocols governing the use of the 3 green phones. During this period, no blue phone made a call to any other phone except one of the other 2 blue phones. You'll see the same sort of triangle as was reminiscent of the green network before you now, with S5 at the apex, S14 at the bottom left, and S7 at the bottom right. So, S5 called both S7 and S14, S7 called S5 but never S14, S14 called S5 but never S7. No phone was used to send or receive SMS text messages. The next slide indicates the obvious similarity between the structure of the 2 phone networks at this stage. These protocols were followed within the blue network from 18 October until December 22nd, when for the first time Blue S7 contacted Blue S14 directly. On the day following that contact, the phone network began to expand with the addition of other blue phones. Those additional blue phones came from 2 sources. The first group is a group of 7 prepaid phones using the Alpha company as the service provider. These phones had first been activated in December of 2003, but had remained virtually unused until they were used to expand the Blue network a year later. I expect the evidence to show that the user of a prepaid phone was required to add credit to the phone every 30 days. Failure to add credit would result in the denial of the phone's ability to make telephone calls. To add credit, the user purchased what was referred to as a recharge or top-up card issued by the company. The user dialed a number assigned by the provider, in the case of Alpha 1456, and provided electronically the number contained on the recharge card. The company then added the amount of the card to the phone's account. The recharge cards were sold in predetermined amounts, the least of which was around $25 US. From the period of their initial activation in December 2003 until they were used to expand the Blue network in late December 2004 and early January 2005, more than a year later, these 7 phones were used to make a total of only 27 calls, as well as 9 SMS or text communications. Now, this slide before you now illustrates when these additions to the Blue network functionally became active. The dark bars on the 7 rows, corresponding to the 7 phone numbers, reflect sporadic calls at isolated time from the initial activations on the 17th of December for the upper 5 and the 23rd of December 03 for the bottom 2 rows. As illustrated, the period in which they each became truly active, except for sporadic calls as can be seen on the upper 5 rows, the period when they each became truly active was when the solid blue bar begins on December 23rd, 04 and 7, 8, and 10 January 2005. Notably, there is no call activity from any of these phones from 9 August 2004 until they become part of the Blue network in December. All 7 were completely silent for 4.5 months before they became active again in late December 2004, early January 2005. Notwithstanding their minimal use, like the 2 green phones that were never used, 2 blue phones were never used until they became Blue phone networks, part of the Blue phone network. Each of the 7 phones continued to be recharged every month so that they were maintained and available for use. In effect, these phones, having been acquired in December of 2003, were held in virtual suspension, on the shelf, as it were, being maintained for a year before being brought into active service to expand the Blue network in December 04 and January 05. Because the recharge process required a call to the assigned service number, 1456, the business records of Alpha contain information about the time of the call and which cell sites the phones connected with at the beginning of the call. Based upon the pattern of days on which the phones were recharged and the cell sites involved, I expect the evidence to support the reasonable inference that during this interim period of a year, the 7 phones were actually managed by 2 different parties, one responsible for recharging 5, while another was responsible for maintaining the remaining 2. This slide illustrates the dates upon which the various Blue phones became truly active, beginning with the original 3 on October 18th, and ending with the final phone joining the network on 12 January 2005. I indicated earlier that I expected the evidence to show that the phones added to increase the blue network from 3 to 15 came from two sources. This first was the group of 7 alpha phones I've just described. The second source were 5 prepaid phones which used MTC as the service provider. And while there is no available evidence as to the dates of their purchase, I expect the evidence to show that the phones were available to be sold sometime between 10 December 2004 and 4 January 2005, and their first calls were between the 7th and 12th of January. Because of this expansion of the blue network from 3 to 15 phones, some of the original protocols governing the usage of the first 3 original phones could no longer be sustained. Others remained. The same discipline governing the use of the blue phones continued. Calls by the blue phones were almost exclusively contained within the group. As a group, 97% of all calls by the blue phones during the material time involved blue network numbers. Even when it expanded to 15 phones, it remained a tightly disciplined, closed network. Months after the assassination, the phones ceased to be recharged, with the exception of one which carried on until at least 2010. For the remaining 14 phones that were active during the material time, I expect the evidence to show that when they were deactivated, there was an aggregate credit balance remaining of $4,287 US. I'll turn now to the red network. The third of the mission phone networks is what the prosecution refers to as the red network. Around the same time as the blue network was being expanded from 3 to 15 phones, concurrent steps were also being taken to create the red network. While the precise date of purchase is unknown, I expect the evidence to show that sometime between 24 December 2004 and 4 January 2005, 8 prepaid SIM cards using Alpha as the service provider were purchased from one or more shops within a small area of Tripoli. Similar to the prepaid blue phones, false identities were submitted by the dealers to Alpha. Each of these identities related to recent purchasers of telephones from either the same shops, and all those purchasers, or those names, who have been interviewed said that they had nothing to do with the purchase of those particular SIM cards. But for the same reasons mentioned earlier regarding the economic rebate incentives offered by the company to dealers who submitted purchasers' names and addresses, the submission of these recycled identities in connection with the 8 red network SIM cards should not be ascribed to the purchasers. However, as with the blue network phones, it is the position of the prosecution that no information concerning an identity was in fact provided by the purchasers of the red network cards. If there had, of course, there would have been no reason for the dealers to use recycled ones. All 8 network SIM cards were used with handsets for the first time on 4 January 2005, when they connected with cell towers or cell sites in the greater Tripoli area. The red phones in there as a group of 8 are before you on the slide now, and I expect there will be evidence from which it will be open for you to find that first, red 741 can be attributed to the accused Ayyash, and the usage of the remaining 5 phones with subject numbers from S5, subject 5 to S9 are consistent with being used by the same blue phone users who are entitled S5 through S9. And 2 further red phones, red 572 and red 662, are unable to be assigned a subject number and in fact drop off in early February in the weeks before the attack, leaving a core group of 6 red phones. And I'll come to that in a little bit.
هل تعني أن الرقمين
Do you mean that the last 2 numbers, what I'm saying, do you mean that the 2 last numbers, red 572 and red 662, have never been used? Is that what you mean?
No, I'm sorry if I gave you that impression. They have been used, they were used up until early February, where they were then set aside. And the 6 numbers that were used from around February the 3rd onwards to February the 14th were the ones that were most involved in the attack. However, the 2 on the bottom were used from the time of their true activation on 14 January 2005 up until the first half of the week in February. The reason that no subject numbers have been assigned to them is because we have no information to connect them with any other phone users. In general, you'll find that the subject numbers are only assignable when there is another phone used by that particular subject. That becomes the only point in assigning a particular subject number to a phone user. So for these 2, they seem to have been used by separate individuals who used just the one phone, one person using 572 and one person using 662. Thank you. So building upon the Blue Network activation slide earlier and showing you now the insertion of the red phones into the co-conspirators' tools, you can see that on an activation date for the red phones from that slide as January 4th, 05, but an actual usage date of 14 January 05. 2 of them, the bottom 2, red 572 and red 662, fall off in early February. The other 6 phones remain until 14 February 05. From the moment of their use on 14 January, the red phones became a closed network, calling only other red phones and not making or receiving calls from outside the red network, except for a couple of very minor anomalies for which logical explanations exist. I expect the evidence to show that these phones connected with cell sites in and around Beirut, as well as around the former Prime Minister's second residence in Fakra and in the Tripoli area. Very brief reference to this particular slide showing the distance between Beirut and Tripoli, which is approximately 84 kilometers. The date upon which the 2 red phones, which were unattributed to identified subjects, stopped being used was February the 3rd of 2005. And the other 6 phones continued to be active until literally minutes before Rafiq Hariri was assassinated, and then all 6 stopped completely and forever. Neither the red SIM cards or the red network handsets were ever used again. This is of enormous evidentiary significance when considering the purpose of the Red Network, which began on January 14. I'm about to turn to a new area. I don't know if this is convenient for you or not.
Very convenient. We'll take a break now until 2:30.
All rise. Veuillez vous lever.